Hi folks, we're back again doing the Old Testament outline. You'll see that last week we were talking about the promises of God and the covenants that he keeps with his people, and how much we rely on the promises of God for our lives and to lead us forward. And the next couple of weeks, we're going to look at Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, the son, grandson, and great-grandson of Abraham. And we're going to look at them as they are given more promises by God, and they trust the promise that God's given, and we'll see their lives. They have, like the rest of us, messy and confused and mixed up lives, but God keeps his promise, and that's what's so amazing. So as we're looking at the Old Testament outline, it's very helpful to know some of the key people, and the family of Abraham are the key people. They become the nation of Israel. And the promises that God made to Abraham, he keeps through that family, through that nation. So we're going to read a little bit from the Bible as we go through. We're going to just hear some of the stories, and we're going to think today about Isaac and Jacob, and then the next time about Joseph and his brothers. It's just a reminder of what we're looking at as we look through the Old Testament. We'll see God's plans coming through. God had always planned to fulfill something that after Adam and Eve had got lost, he wasn't afraid or confused or upset. He knew what the plan was. And so we need to remember that God had a plan even before that and was fulfilling the plan. And so to prepare the way for things, he needed people to know that he was there. And so he chose some people to show his kindness to and make promises to, so that people would know that he is a God who is there, who keeps his promises. But it's obvious that man needs help and man is lost. But God doesn't give up on them. And even when Isaac and Jacob and the other people in his family make mistakes and fall apart and get lost, God doesn't stop caring. He intensely desires a relationship with them, and he will bring about the right thing in the end. So as we see the lives of Isaac and Jacob, we're going to think about God just being there. There's a constant reminder that God is in this, and that's what makes the difference. It's not that Isaac and Jacob are better men or smarter or do the right things or anything. It's down to God being there that things work out for them. So we're going to look, first of all, as we were saying, this is the timeline that we're working on. We looked at the early fathers. We looked a bit about Noah, and then we talked about Abraham. And then we looked at promises that God made to Adam and Eve, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the rest all the way through. But today we're going to look at Isaac and Jacob. Remember, Isaac was the son of the promise that God made to Abraham, but he wasn't born for a long time. Abraham was old when Isaac was born. So let's have a look at a couple of the things about Isaac. Now, well, first of all, Isaac's the carrier of the promise. He's the promised baby. Just as the Messiah is the promised one, Isaac is the promised one for Abraham. And Abraham was promised that he would have a son with Sarah. And Sarah was 99 years old, and she still hadn't had a son. But God had said. And so when she's 100 years old, Isaac is born. And so all these promises that God made to Abraham were held in Isaac. And Abraham knew it, and Isaac knew it. It's interesting that as Abraham takes Isaac up the hill to sacrifice him, that Isaac just goes along with it. He trusts his father, and he says, well, where's the lamb? Some of the most major things in Isaac's life go on around him. It's not the decisions he makes. It's not the things that he does. He's the carrier of the promise. Sometimes we think that it's about what we do. It's about the decisions we make and how well we do at life. Well, if you need an answer to that, Isaac's your answer. Isaac didn't do anything spectacular, but God did. God was with him. God helped him. We see the promise that God says, I gave this promise to Abraham, so I will keep it in you. And you think, he's not even making a new promise to Isaac. He's making the same promise. He's making a consistent promise. And he's saying to Isaac, that promise, I'll keep it for you. I've said to Abraham, and now I'm saying to you, that's the promise. And Isaac's the carrier of that promise. In the New Testament, God makes more promises to us. He makes the promise that he'll bring us home to heaven. And we're carriers of that promise. We're not the keeper of the promise. God is the keeper of the promise. It's his covenant. But we can claim it and we can trust in it, not because we've done the right things or because we're in the right place, but because God has promised it. And when God promises it, he keeps his promise. So maybe it's a chance for you to think about what it means to be the carrier of a promise. It's not about how well you do something or your way of getting through. It's down to the fact that God put things in place. And God put lots of things in place for Isaac. First of all, he puts in place a wife. And we know exactly that it's God's work because we read about it. In Genesis, he doesn't even do anything. It's not Isaac who goes to find a wife. It's actually the servant of Abraham. So in Genesis 24, Abraham, who's very old, sends a servant, his senior servant in his household, and says to him, you go and get a wife for my son. So Isaac hasn't gone to get a wife, but the servant is sent, and Abraham says, don't just take one from local here. They're all a mess. These are not good people. God called me to take this land, but not to mix with these people. Go back to my family. So the servant goes back to the land, and you can read it in Genesis 24. And the servant, when he gets there, he asks God to give him a sign. He says to God, you show me that this is your doing. You show me that this is your doing. So this beautiful young woman comes out to the place where he's sitting to water, to get water. And when he asks for water, she says, not only will I give you water, I'll give water to your animals as well. She goes above and beyond. She's a good woman. She's a beautiful woman, but she's a good woman. She makes good things happen, and she blesses him. And that was the sign that the servant had asked for. You see, God's saying, I'm in this. This is the one. And then he goes back and he finds out it's actually Abraham's family. This woman is the right woman. She's from Abraham's family, and she's a good woman, and she's the one that should be for Isaac. You see, all of that, and Isaac's done nothing. Abraham sent him. The servant asked God to be in it. And then he goes back, and Rebecca's willing to go with him. She says, well, if that's God's doing, I'll do it. She's willing to listen to God's leading. Sometimes it's hard to find people who are willing to listen to God's leading. But she says, okay, if God says this is the right thing, I am not going to argue. And even though I've never met your master, and even though I don't know you, you're just some guy who turned up and has money and says there's a man waiting for me. But if God says, I'll go. So God puts in place for Isaac a good wife, the right woman, a faithful woman, one who trusts God. It's not the only thing he puts in place. He puts lands and he gives them wealth and prosperity, and there's famines and it doesn't affect him, and he gets richer and stronger and more powerful, and God keeps providing for him. Isaac's done nothing. It's quite amazing. And God keeps the promise. He has 2 children, 2 sons, Jacob and Esau. They're twins, and they're born from Rebekah, and they're his sons. And God says, there's your promise. There's your promise fulfilled. But all of that is God's doing. It's keeping his promise to Abraham through Isaac. And Isaac hasn't really done anything amazing. In actual fact, he makes the same stupid mistake his dad made on more than one occasion. He pretends that his wife is his sister. And the frustrating thing is, it's the same family he makes the claim to. It's the family of Abimelech. Abimelech's father was also called Abimelech, and his father was also called Abimelech. And Abraham pretended his wife was his sister, to Abimelech, and then his son makes the same claim to his son. It's crazy. Why would you do it? See, Isaac's afraid that he'll be killed because his wife is beautiful. And the king, if the king wants something, the king gets something. And he's the king in that land, and yet Isaac has a big family, a big following. He has no reason to be afraid, and God is with him. And yet Isaac's still afraid. It's interesting that when he makes that mistake, it leads to all sorts of other quarrels. So the king says, the king is very gracious, as his father was to Abraham. But the king said, we could have got in real trouble here if somebody had taken her as their wife, because she's your wife. That shouldn't happen. But it's quite amazing that Isaac's life just seems to all work out. And even with the mistakes and the quarrels that rise up from it. So the people that are friends with Abimelech now struggle with Isaac to trust him. And they start realizing that this man is as powerful as the king, and they don't know what to do about it. And he's getting richer and richer, and he keeps digging wells and finding water, and water's the most precious resource. And they ask him to leave, get out of our land. And so he moves a little bit further north, I think it's north, and he takes another bit of land, and then God blesses him there too. And all the quarrels and all the mess, it's his mix-up, it's his world, it's his life, and yet he's really done nothing amazing. Later on, we'll read about him being deceived by Rebekah and Jacob, that in the end, what God is doing, what God puts in place for him, he also puts in place for Jacob. Even though Isaac thinks that his son Esau should get all the prizes and all the things, God has prepared Jacob. Jacob and Esau are born as twins, and Jacob sticks his foot out first. You're not supposed to come out foot first. So they shove him back in, and then Esau comes out first. And so Jacob is the second born, not the firstborn. And so the firstborn is supposed to get all the rights and all the honor and all the inheritance. And yet God works out his promise that Jacob will get those things, even despite Isaac. It's really interesting as all of this goes through that Isaac doesn't seem to be in charge of anything. He doesn't seem to go and take charge and own the things and rule life. He just listens. He just goes along with things. He listens to his dad when he's going to sacrifice him. He listens to the servant when he says, this is the wife for you. He listens to Rebekah, and he listens to Jacob when he pretends to be Esau. But in a way, instead of us being so assertive and trying to make our own way, maybe that's the right thing to do, because in that, then God is able to weave his plan, to put his promise into place, to make things right. Jacob and Isaac receive great blessing from God. And Isaac doesn't seem to do anything to earn it. And Jacob just seems to make a mess of everything. We'll come to Jacob. So Isaac's life seems to be, it works out well, everything goes great. And yet there's nothing in particular that he does. And the key verses maybe we could look at are in Genesis 26. Sorry, I see you might not be able to see the end of that line because of my face. In verse 24, it says this: "That night the Lord appeared to him and said, I am the God of your father Abraham. Do not be afraid, for I am with you. I will bless you and will increase the number of your descendants for the sake of my servant Abraham." It's not even for your sake. I do it because I've already made the promise. It's really interesting. This is a time when all these quarrels have kicked off. Every time that Isaac digs a well, somebody else claims it, or they stop it up. They try and stop him getting more herds, more wealth, more crops. He plants a crop and gets 100 times as much back. And they're scared of him because he seems to be so lucky and so blessed. And then God says to him, look, I'm with you. That's why everything is working out. I'm with you. I've got you. I will keep the promise I made to your father through you. I will increase your family. And Genesis 26:28 is the response of some of the men around him, and Abimelech being one of them, the king, and a couple of his key men. His personal advisor and the commander of his armies come and see Isaac. And they say this to him. They answered, we saw clearly that the Lord was with you. We saw clearly that God was with you. It's not in doing loads of things. It's not in being the best that we can be that people will see that God's with us. It's in allowing God to work. It's in listening to him and following him. God said, go to the land. Abraham went. God said to Isaac, stay in that land. Don't leave it. Isaac stayed. God said, I'll bless you. And Isaac was blessed. And it seemed to be that he had success in things without doing it. And the people around him saw that it was God. They answered, we saw clearly that the Lord was with you. So we said there ought to be a sworn agreement between us. We need to make a deal with this guy before we get in trouble, because God is with him. Isaac was very blessed. And he passed on that blessing to Jacob, not necessarily by choice, but he passed on that blessing to Jacob. God fulfilled so many promises for Isaac and will fulfill more through Jacob. And all of that Isaac looks at and lives and gets to experience, not because he did the right things or made all the right choices, but because God said, I'll do this. We possibly try too hard to make it all happen. And if you think Isaac seems to let things happen, Jacob's the other way around. He's always trying to do something to work things out for good. He's cunning and deceitful. He's the sort of guy who's kind of deceptive, always looking for a chance to get something out of things. He says to his brother, sell me your birthright for a bowl of soup. And his brother's hungry and he's like, well, just give me the soup. Sell me your birthright. All right, whatever. Just give me food. I'm hungry. And so Jacob steals his birthright. Then he steals his blessing. He goes and pretends to be Esau. He puts hair on his arms to make him feel hairy. And he smells. He covers himself in the smell of animals so that he smells like his brother. And he deceives Isaac. He deceives his father. His mom says, go do that, because she likes Jacob better than Esau. His father likes Esau better than Jacob. But God's plan is fulfilled. Even though Jacob's cunning and trying to make it happen, I want the blessing. It's scary what's going on, that he's trying to work it out. He's trying to make it through. He's trying to make a plan. The next thing that happens is he realizes that Esau is raging, because fully ripping he is, because he stole his birthright and he stole his blessing. And so Jacob flees and he crosses the river to get away. And as he crosses the river, there's just him. And his mom says, go, leave here, but what you should do is go and find a wife. And don't just find one around here. Just like Abraham, she's wise enough to say, go back to my family. Find a good wife there. Actually, what happens is that Jacob leaves, and as he goes, he stops to sleep. And when he sleeps, he sees a ladder to heaven and angels going up and coming down, and he realizes that God is right there with him. He's been trying to make it all happen, and yet all the time God is saying, look, I'm right here. My angels are right here. Whatever you need, I've got it right here. So Jacob has this amazing vision of a ladder going up to heaven. If you haven't heard of Jacob's ladder, you have now. And so he leaves and he goes to his mother's family, to his uncle, his mother's brother, Laban. And there he gets into all sorts of complicated stuff as well, because Laban's just as deceitful as him, and they start trying to cheat each other out of things. So Jacob says, I want to marry your daughter. I want to marry my cousin. He's saying, so I want to marry Rachel. She's very beautiful and she seems to be a good woman. I want to marry Rachel. So Laban gets Leah, her big sister, all dressed up and makes it all dark, and they get married and they go to the bedroom, and she's covered in a veil when they get married, and they go to the bedroom and they sleep together. And then the next morning he realizes it's the wrong sister. And he gets really angry with Laban, and Laban says, well, you can have the other one too, but you have to work another 7 years, 7 years for the first one and 7 years for the second one. So Jacob now is committed to staying there with his uncle for 14 years for his two brides. He didn't want to, but he's got to, and they're constantly bickering, they're sisters, and there's all this kind of confusion and mess in his life, because he's trying to find his way through it. He's trying to make it all happen. Then he tries to come to an agreement with his uncle about the flocks, right? Well, I need wealth of my own. I need to be able to bring up my own family. I've got lots of kids now. He ends up having 12 sons and some daughters as well. And he ends up with 2 wives and 2 concubines, which are like extra wives. And Laban is rich, and he's saying, look, let me have a share of your wealth. And he says, well, you can have all the spotted sheep. And then he takes away all the spotted sheep and all the black sheep so that there can't be any spotted sheep. But then Jacob comes up with a way to make all the sheep spotted sheep, and the two of them are trying to out-deceive each other. And anyway, it comes to 6 years or up. He's worked there for his uncle for 20 years, and he's now got loads of sheep of his own, and he thinks, right, we need to do a runner before my uncle finds out, and we need to do it fast. So they get up and they run away. It's amazing how he's always trying to make it happen. His uncle comes after him, and he's angry. And when he catches up on Jacob, he's about to have a go at him, but God speaks to Laban and says, look, be careful what you say to Jacob, because he is mine. And all the time that Jacob thinks he's making things work out, it's always been God. God's always had that plan in place. And so Laban comes and he's trying to get a hold of Jacob, but he can't, because God says, be careful. Jacob is mine. And as Jacob realized from the experience of the ladder, he realizes that God's with him. We can see those key verses in Genesis 31. Laban catches him up and he says, I have the power to harm you. But last night, the God of your father said to me, be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad. Be careful. And Jacob's response to Laban is this: if the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac had not been with me, you would have surely left me empty-handed. You're a cheeky boy. Takes one to know one, maybe. But God has seen my hardship and the toil of my hands, and last night he rebuked you. I don't think it was so much about the toil of his hands, but God saw him. He was the promised one still. He was the keeper of the promise. Jacob still thinks it's about him. And the key incident in Jacob's life is the next chapter, or at the end of chapter 32, when God wrestles with him. And Jacob feels like he wins, because he says, I will not let go of you until you bless me. He doesn't know who this man is that he's wrestling with, but he says, until you bless me, I won't let go of you. It's only then that it's only when he asks, who are you? And God says, do you know who I am? Why are you asking, who am I? That he realizes that he's wrestled with God. And he realizes that what he's been doing the whole time is wrestling with God, trying to find his way to get blessed, trying to find his way to get an answer. Here he is running from Laban, but he realizes the only land he can go back to is the land that Esau has, his brother. And his brother, the last time he saw him, was raging with him, furious. He's got a guy behind him who's angry and a guy who's in front of him who's angry. And now he realizes that what really matters is that he's got God with him. It wasn't about how well he did at breeding the sheep. It was about God blessing him. It wasn't that he made great decisions and stole the birthright and stole the blessing. God had already decided that he would be the one who was blessed. And it was at that point when he wrestled with God that I think Jacob stops trying to be the one in charge of it all. So he and his 12 sons and his 4 wives go to meet Esau. And he says this amazing thing to God. Let me find it. So he's going to meet Esau and he's afraid. And he says to God, he's crossing the river that he crossed when he was running away. And he says to God, when I crossed this river the last time, I had nothing. I had nothing. And here I am, I've become 2 camps. He splits his family into 2 large camps so that if his brother really is angry at him and he attacks one of the camps, maybe the other camp will get away. He realizes God has blessed him far more than he ever could have thought. And he says this to God, I am unworthy. It's Genesis 32:10. I am unworthy of all the kindness and faithfulness you have shown your servant. I had only my staff when I crossed this Jordan, but now I've become 2 camps. Save me, I pray, from the hand of my brother Esau, for I'm afraid he will come and attack me, and also the mothers with their children. But you have said, I will surely make you prosper, and will make your descendants like the sand of the sea, which cannot be counted. He realizes that it's not about what he's done or how well he's achieved things or how big his family is. It comes down to God being with him. He's just the keeper of that promise. He's just the one who holds it. God is the keeper of the promise, and Jacob is the one who's the holder of it. I think sometimes we're so busy trying to make things happen. And this lockdown time has made us feel all like we're not achieving anything and we're not able to do what we'd like to do, and we're frustrated. And maybe it's a good lesson to learn from both Isaac and Jacob. It isn't about what you do or how well you've done or what you've achieved or how your life stands out and all the things. And you look at all the blessings you have and you think, wow, isn't that great? I've done well for myself. And what you need to realize is, no, God has blessed you. If God is with you, he'll bless you. He'll look after you. Doesn't necessarily mean you'll have loads of riches like Isaac and Jacob. I mean, they were very rich. Doesn't necessarily mean money or even family. Jacob had tons of sons, and that's not necessarily the promise to you. We need to remember it's not about how much we achieve, how well we've done. It's about God saying, I will keep the promise. And so Jacob has 12 sons. They're messy and they're mixed up. And when you read about the tribes that come out of them, they're even messier and more mixed up. But Jacob is the keeper of that promise. He is the one who has that promise, who was given that promise, the bearer of the promise. It's not about him. It's about God. With both Isaac and Jacob, when Esau comes, he says, I don't need your money. I'm not angry at you. I've got everything I ever wanted. You didn't steal anything from me, essentially. I've ended up being rich and I have family. I don't need your riches or your family, or I'm not going to attack you. But Jacob and Esau and Isaac, they all think they're going to make it happen. But God makes his plan happen. As we look at the Old Testament, you'll read a lot of stories where you think, what is going on there? Those people are a mess. They're doing all sorts of terrible things. You read about Judah later on, one of Jacob's sons, and what he does with his daughter-in-law, and you think it's a mess. It's terrible. What is going on? And yet God fulfills so many promises through Judah, through Tamar, his daughter-in-law. And you look at the mess of these lives, and you look at the things that they do right and wrong, and all the trying and all the effort. And in the end, what really matters is God's promise. Isaac and Jacob had ups and downs and were all over the place, but they both received the promise of God. They both received his blessing. They both trusted him. They both came back to him when they lost it. And the lesson for us when we're reading all these history stories of so many people is not, oh, this is what you should do, or this is what you shouldn't do. This is what is really going on. There are ups and downs, there are messes, there are problems, but there's a God who's in it all. We'll see that even more in the life of Joseph. God makes Joseph a promise, and his whole entire life seems to go in the opposite direction. And yet God says, no, I've got this. Jacob and Isaac seem to have lives full of ups and downs and mess. I don't think that's any different from the rest of us. One of them just seems to let life happen. The other one seems to try everything he can possibly do. And in the end, it doesn't matter. They're the bearers of the promise. They're the one whose the promise is in. And God is the one who keeps his promise. I hope that doesn't sound too complicated. There are more stories about both Isaac and Jacob that you can read in Genesis. But to me, they're a good example, not of being the right person or doing the right thing, but what it means to really be the holder of a promise from God. As Christians, that is what we say we are. Don't say we're good. Don't say we get things right. If you look at history, if you look at all the great Bible teachers and all the people who've done things for God, they've also made huge mistakes. You see it right through the Old Testament and the New. We're not perfect. We're not good, but we're holders of God's promise. And He is faithful. I hope you've learned from the example of Isaac and Jacob